Well, I think there are a tremendous amount of misconceptions about communism. A lot of, horror stories been told about communism. How is genuine communism different than what people's misconceptions are? And also, what's maybe new and surprising to people about the new communism?
The main misconceptions people have are the ones that have been spread by the people who have the most interest in not seeing a radically different society, fundamentally different relations and culture and so on. Namely, the people who rule over the present system, the capitalist imperialist ruling classes in different countries, including at the top of the heap, the ruling class of this country. Those are the people that have the most interest in distorting what communism is about. And it goes from everything. You can watch something, like Jeopardy, and, all of a sudden you're listening to the questions and trying to figure out the answer, or listening to the answer and trying to figure out the question as it goes on Jeopardy. And all of a sudden they sneak in some anti-communist, attack within a question. Never do they talk about the crimes of the CIA. They never have a question that says, for what, institution in the US government was responsible for the slaughter of nearly 1 million people in Indonesia? Is it the CIA? Yes, it is. No, they never have those kind of questions on Jeopardy, but they have all kinds of slander about communism. And then they have the contest they start out distorting the number of people who, are supposedly killed by Mao in China or whatever. And then they have a contest to see who can escalate the number. Oh, it was 10 million people killed by Mao. Oh, no, it was 20 million people. Oh, it was 30 million people. It was 40 million people. And none of those statistics are correct. There were hardships in China. If people who read, the Pearl Buck novels and so on back in the 1930s or whatever, could learn about what the terrible conditions of the masses of peasants who made up the great majority in the hundreds of millions in that society, what they were living like, and why they needed a revolution, how the revolution liberated and uplifted them out of those conditions. Eliminating massive diseases, eliminating the plagues of drug addiction. I remember I was in China in 1971, and I talked to a woman, whose son had been working in the mines in the old society. And it was for the mine workers, it was very much like the slaves in the US before the Civil War. They had a saying, the slaves in the US, working from can't see in the morning till can't see at night. And I remember this woman telling us that her son said he never saw the sun, because they worked 7 days a week and they would go into the mines before the sun came up and they would leave after it went down. And this, under terrible conditions of people. And so to deal with this, her son and millions of others became opium addicts. And all this was uprooted and eliminated when they got rid of these exploitative conditions in China. The oppression of women, on all kinds of levels, of bending, the binding of the feet of women so they would walk, like this and look more quote unquote sexy or whatever. All these, mass prostitution, which is now back in China, now that the revolution that Mao led has been reversed and capitalism has been restored in China. All these terrible things that went on, that the revolution moved to overcome and to uplift people beyond. And yes, were there shortcomings in these revolutions? Of course. These were unprecedented attempts of masses of human beings to transform whole societies. In the case of China, hundreds of millions of people, moving to transform society, to transform every aspect of it, a stultifying culture that reinforced all the feudal and capitalist relations of exploitation, the educational system, the culture, the science, to reorient them to serving the people, as was the popular slogan in China, for example. So in a massive undertaking, a massive, struggle like this, of course, mistakes are going to be made. And yes, there were some shortcomings in the understanding of the leadership, which contributed to those mistakes. So on the one hand, if we step back and look at the big picture, the grand picture of hundreds of millions of people engaging in a struggle to uproot all this oppression and exploitation and degradation, we can say, if you look into it honestly and scientifically, that it was tremendously positive in its main aspect. At the same time, we also have to scientifically analyze that there were real shortcomings, not only in what was done, but also in the conception and in the approach of those who were leading it. So that's a scientific assessment, and that's very important for people, including the great mass of people now who are not communists, don't consider them communists, to understand. Because another reason why people should care and should understand is, masses of people really do care about the kinds of things that a communist revolution would actually deal with. But they don't know that. And so they need to look into that, because people are frustrated, angry. I mean, among the youth today, there's all this depression and anxiety and suicide. Why? One of the main reasons is that they don't think there's any alternative to this horrific way that they're forced to live, even if they don't have an understanding either right now without the scientific approach of why the world is the way it is. They've been bombarded with the notion, inundated with the notion that there's no alternative to this, and that's very depressing.